Hi students, it's me again. I'm going to try to give you a brief rundown of some playwrights of note that we won't be spending a great deal of time talking about, but they should be mentioned in the context of this emergence of the 20th century. Now, as we've seen, the 20th century has brought the rise of the American theater, and we discussed that a little bit last time. And as you know, in Europe, we're seeing the end of the age of Romanticism. And hopefully Monday and Wednesday, you'll be looking at Cyrano de Bergerac, which captures the sense of the era of Romanticism. It's really a comedy, but it has many of the elements that I discussed from Alexandre Dumas in his The Three Musketeers and The Man in the Iron Mask, and The Count of Monte Cristo, and his son's work, The Lady of the Camellias. But Cyrano de Bergerac will give you a good feel for the era of Romanticism, and pay particular note to Cyrano de Bergerac because there will be test quizzes, test questions about Cyrano de Bergerac when that comes up. But as you also know, the late 19th century, early 20th century sees the rise of the fellow named George Bernard Shaw. And you have been given a hard copy of Pygmalion, which you will be reading if you have not read it already. And some of his other plays include Saint Joan, about Joan of Arc, Man and Superman, which is a sort of a rambling philosophical piece culminating in Don Juan in Hell, which is usually done as a single act. The entire evening is given to Don Juan in Hell. Arms and the Man, the story of a sort of cowardly soldier who hides out in a young girl's boudoir. Candida, his adaptation of Voltaire's comedy Candide. Caesar and Cleopatra is a wonderful piece of work. It's a comedy about, as you would imagine, Caesar meeting Cleopatra in Egypt at a time when she desperately needs someone to back her up as her brother Ptolemy is trying to take the throne away from her. Major Barbara, a story of a woman in the Salvation Army, and Androcles and the Lion, the story of it's a children's play, actually, story of Androcles coming across a lion in great pain in the woods, and he takes a thorn out of the lion's paw, and the lion is very grateful to Androcles, and Androcles is caught by the Romans because he's a Christian, and he's thrown into the circus, and he's going to be thrown to the lions, and when he's thrown to the lions, what lion should be there waiting for him but the one from whose paw he took the thorn? It's a wonderful piece of work. But there are three playwrights equally worthy of mention in the 20th century that we won't be spending that much time discussing. Arthur Miller we will discuss. You will be looking at Death of a Salesman. His other major works include All My Sons, which is also about a father who commits suicide. A View from the Bridge, the story of immigrants struggling to stay employed when there's a crackdown on people who don't have visas. So it's as timely today as it was when he wrote it. The Crucible, an allegory for what was called the McCarthy witch hunt. In the 1950s, people were accused of being communists, and Arthur Miller had to face the House Un-American Activities Committee to defend himself for having written The Crucible. He came out of it in one piece, I'm pleased to say. And After the Fall, which is a fictionalized version of his marriage to Marilyn Monroe, whom some of you may have heard of, and her previous husband, Joe DiMaggio. So Arthur Miller wrote other plays besides Death of a Salesman, but I need to make mention of two playwrights that we're not going to spend very much time with. One of them is Eugene O'Neill. Now, we discussed Eugene O'Neill briefly the other day when I told you that his father, James O'Neill, had made practically a career out of doing The Count of Monte Cristo. The play Long Day's Journey into Night concerns Eugene and his father and his morphine-addicted mother and his drunkard older brother. The Iceman Cometh, it's regularly revived about down-and-out drunks in a saloon in the turn of the century, and again his brother Jamie is represented by Harry Hope. Wilderness is his comedy about a young boy coming of age in New England at the turn of the century. Anna Christie, the story of a prostitute on the waterfront who falls in love. Morning becomes Electra. Again, you see a 20th century American playwright stealing from the classics, in this case the classic tragedy Electra. Desire Under the Elms, the story of an older farmer with a young bride who has an illicit affair. Moon for the Misbegotten, the story of a wayward son who has an affair with the girl next door, presumed to be the town strumpet, who is in fact a virgin. And The Emperor Jones, a story of Brutus Jones, who a Pullman porter who commits a murder and goes on the lam and finds himself in the West Indies, where he becomes the leader of a small West Indies nation. And he proclaims himself emperor and thinks he is invulnerable, but in fact he is not. It's based on a story by Rudyard Kipling called The Man Who Would Be King, and Brutus Jones is a wonderful piece, as are most of the plays by Eugene O'Neill. I should also make mention of a fellow named Tennessee Williams that we won't be spending much time with, but he bears mentioning today. He wrote several plays that are still done all the time. The Glass Menagerie, the story of an impoverished family in St. Louis in the 1930s, and how the disabled younger sister is set up with a fellow from Tom's workplace, Tom being the pseudonym character for Tennessee Williams himself. A Streetcar Named Desire. Well, you can hardly put on TCM without seeing a listing for a Streetcar Named Desire from 1948, I believe. It's the story of two sisters, Blanche and Stella. Stella is married to a big burly guy named Stanley Kowalski, a man's man, if you will. They live in New Orleans in an apartment, and not a very elegant apartment. And Stella comes from a family that had great aspirations of Southern glory and dignity, as a lot of people in the South did in the early part of the 20th century. But Stella has been away from her sister Blanche for a long time and doesn't know that Blanche has had to sell the family estate because they have become impoverished. And Blanche had to leave her job at the school because she had an illicit affair with a student. And so Blanche comes to live with Stella and Stanley, and Stella is pregnant. And during the time of her pregnancy, Blanche's residence in the Kowalski apartment becomes rather a burden on Stanley, and he starts to become quite irritated at her presence. And when Stella goes to the hospital to have the baby, Stanley assaults Blanche sexually, and the play ends with Blanche having a nervous breakdown and being taken away to an asylum. It's a classic American tragedy, A Streetcar Named Desire. Another play that you're likely to hear about in conjunction with Tennessee Williams is Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, the story of Brick and Maggie at Big Daddy's house for his birthday soiree. Big Daddy is dying of cancer and Brick is next in line to his fortune, but Brick and Maggie haven't had a baby, and it's implied that the reason for that is that Brick may have had a homosexual affair with a fellow named Skipper. Sweet Bird of Youth, the story of a fading actress. Night of the Iguana, a story of an American couple in the Caribbean who are set upon by a story of cannibals. Tennessee Williams, the great playwright of the American South of the 20th century. Eugene O'Neill, representing, I think, more than anything else, New England, in the 20th century. And Arthur Miller, a native of Brooklyn, who wrote the quintessential American tragedy, Death of a Salesman, which you'll become familiar with in a matter of days at this point. All right, I hope this 10-minute video conference has given you at least an interest in George Bernard Shaw, Tennessee Williams, Arthur Miller, and Eugene O'Neill. We will be hearing more from Arthur Miller, and of course you will be seeing and reading Shaw's Pygmalion. But I think that's enough for today, so have a nice day and enjoy the sun.